Well, thank you all for being here this afternoon, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to Riggs Library for a special event with distinguished civil servant, diplomat, author Kishore Mahbubani, a gathering hosted in collaboration with our initiative for U.S.-China dialogue on global issues. And I'm grateful to Kishore for joining us today to discuss his latest book, Has the West Lost It? A Provocation. And I also wish to thank Dr. Victor Cha, director of our Asian Studies program and our DS Song chair in the Department of Government and School of Foreign Service, who will join him in conversation after Kishore delivers some opening reflections. We gather this afternoon at an extraordinary moment in history, a moment shaped by unprecedented advances in technology, a time when people are more interconnected than ever, and when established institutions are called on to find new ways of impacting our changing world. How we respond to these changes and challenges, to the increasing thrust of globalization, is one of the defining issues of our time. Kishore Mahbubani has provided remarkable scholarship and global leadership in addressing the need for new structures and ways of thinking as we respond to these new realities. In a recent interview, he said, and I quote, "We now live in a small interdependent planet. We can continue to grow our economies. We can continue to improve lives of our people without having to go to war with each other, without having to fight each other. Those 19th century games need no longer be played in the 21st century." Close quote. He has engaged in the highest levels of diplomacy throughout his career and has drawn from these experiences in his writing and scholarship. He serves as senior advisor of University and Global Relations and professor in the practice of public policy at the National University of Singapore, where he also served as dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School for 13 years and completed that service in December of this past year. As a member of the Republic of Singapore's Foreign Service, he held postings in Malaysia, Washington, D.C., Cambodia, and New York, where he twice served as Singapore's ambassador to the United Nations and as president of the UN Security Council. He's written on foreign policy in a range of publications and has authored or co-authored or edited 9 critically acclaimed books on the subject of Asia and global affairs. And following his remarks, to engage him in conversation, we're honored to have with us Dr. Victor Cha, an extraordinary scholar of international relations and Asian foreign policy here at Georgetown. His leadership of our Asian Studies program, which has been designated a national resource center on East Asia, has been crucial in strengthening and advancing this area of focus for us. In 2012, he founded and he continues to direct our master's degree in Asian Studies. In addition to serving as the DS Song Korea Foundation Endowed Chair in International Affairs in the Department of Government and the School of Foreign Service, he's also a senior advisor on Korea at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And from 2004 to 2007, he served at the White House as Director for Asian Affairs on the National Security Council. He was our primary point of contact for security issues in the Korean Peninsula, in Australia, New Zealand, and the Pacific Islands. So we're deeply grateful to all of you for being with us this afternoon. And Kishore and Victor, thank you for being a part of this wonderful convening. And now I'd like to invite Kishore to our podium to offer some reflections on his new book.
Is it okay if I speak from here? Is the mic on? Yeah, okay. First of all, Jack, thank you very much for that kind comments, and thank you very much for your warm and generous hospitality here in Georgetown University. I'm truly grateful to you. And I should begin by announcing I'm a great admirer of Jack. He, like me, studied philosophy, but he knows much more of it than I do. And as you know, he's done a great job here at Georgetown University, and I'm very, very happy to be here with you to speak about my latest book. Now, as you know, if you want to sell books and your book begins with a question mark, has the West lost it? You don't give away the answer. But I'm a nice guy, okay, like Jack. I'll give you the answer to the question, has the West lost it? And the answer is no. Or more accurately, not yet. Because my big fear, and the reason why I wrote this book now, is that the West could very well lose it if it continues going on autopilot. So the purpose of this book is, as one of my friends said, it's kind of a love letter to the West. It's an attempt to say, wake up, there's a new world, adjust to it, and it'll be a better world for all of us. So what I have to explain my thesis to you, I plan to divide my remarks into 3 parts in the 25 minutes that I have. To first speak about what is the state of our world today. And then, part 2, speak about what I believe are some of the strategic mistakes that the West has made. And then in part 3, I'll try and explain how the West can take a new course that'll be better for the West and for the rest of the world too. But to begin by talking about the state of the world today, I'm going to say something very, very shocking to many people, especially those who live in the West. And the biggest truth of our times is that humanity has never been in a better condition than it is today. I mean, this comes as a shock to many with all the doom and gloom here. And to explain that statement, let me just give you some big examples of how humanity today is much better off. 3 areas. First area, as you know, the most difficult part of the human condition is war and peace. And since the beginning of human history, we've been fighting wars. People have been dying in great wars. Exactly 100 years ago, if you can remember what the world was like in 1918, at the end of World War I, how many millions had died then, right? And what most people are not aware of is that today we are living in the most peaceful time ever in human history. And of course, there's data to back this up. I cite Steven Pinker, and he says, as he explains, today we are probably living the most peaceful moment of our species time on Earth, because global violence has fallen steadily since the middle of the 20th century, and the number of battle deaths in interstate wars has declined from more than 65,000 per year in the 1950s to less than 2,000 per year in this decade. As a spectacular decrease. There may be ups and downs, Syria and so on and so forth, but the long-term trend is definitely going down. Then take the other area. We've been trying to get rid of poverty since the beginning of human history, right? And I can tell you as a student who studied in the 70s and 80s, the economists almost like gave up and said we can never eradicate human poverty. It's existential part of the human condition. And here is another area where we have made remarkable progress. Now, in 1950, now that's not so long ago, and that's 2 years after I was born. In 1950, 75% of the world, 75% were living in extreme poverty. In 1981, it was still 44%, but by 2016, it had fallen to below 10%. Now, I can tell you as someone who grew up as a poor child, in a poor family, in a poor society, Singapore, which had the same per capita income as Ghana, I can tell you that poverty is the most debilitating condition. And by the way, for my first day at school, I was put in a special feeding program at the age of 6 because I was technically undernourished. As you can see now, I'm overnourished. In some ways, my life experience to go from that kind of extreme poverty to where it is today is something that so much of humanity has gone through. And that, I can tell you that future historians will marvel at our times and say, this is amazing. They took the humanity, which had 75% of the world living in extreme poverty, to less than 10%, and by 2030, it could even go down to zero, right? Now, let me quickly give you another statistic to illustrate how the world is a much better place. Most of you, I suspect, belong to the middle classes. And the global middle class population is exploding from 1.8 billion in 2010 to 3.2 billion in 2020 to 4.9 billion in 2030. So more than half the world's population is going to enjoy global middle class living standards. Again, an amazing transformation of the human condition. But of course, the big question is, why is this happening now? And here I must say, one of the biggest messages I give in this book is that the reason why the human condition has improved as much as it has, especially in the last 30 to 40 years, is because Western civilization has shared its gifts with the rest of the world. If there's one place that the rest of the world needs to send a thank you note to, it is to the West. And by the way, just for your information, only 12% of the world's population lives in the West. 88% lives outside the West. And this 88% has benefited tremendously from the advances made by the West. And as I say in this book, on page 11, The Gift of Western Wisdom, the one fundamental thing that the West gifted to other societies was what I call the gift of reasoning, and to explaining to the rest of the world how if you use reason, if you use science and technology, if you use methods, rational methods, you can actually solve many of the problems in the world. And the reason, for example, how we've eliminated poverty is with the spread of ideas from the West, including the ideas of modern economics, free market ideas, and so on and so forth. And as a result of this, what most people are not aware of is that there have been three fundamental revolutions in the rest of the world. And these fundamental revolutions have lifted up the human condition. Again, I don't have much time, but let me just briefly explain what I say in this book. The first fundamental revolution is the political revolution. And here again, this is a simple fact of history. For most of human history, in most societies, and especially, I can say in Asia, we lived in what you might call feudal conditions, where a very tiny, small feudal elite made the decisions, and the rest of the society just obeyed, lived under the thumb. It was a top-down process. Through the spread of Western ideas, right, it became a bottom-up process. And the top realized that they were accountable to the bottom. Now that seems to you like simple, commonsensical thing, but that's a fundamental change in the human condition. The kind of the privileged elites and the control of power that they used to have evaporated, disappeared. You've seen this, of course, with the spread of democracy. But what might come as a big shock to you is that even in a place like China, which has no democracy, right? Even in China, you see the transition from Mao Zedong, where you had a dictator with absolute powers deciding what he wanted to do, and nobody could challenge him, to the new government in China, which understands that it is accountable to the Chinese people, and that's why the condition of the Chinese people has improved far more in the past 30 years than it ever has in Chinese history. One small political revolution makes a huge difference. The second change is what I call the psychological revolution. And this is something I can speak about with great conviction because I grew up at a time, my parents never went to university, never went to school, right? My mother stopped school after 6 years. My father didn't even survive that long. And their view of life was that everything in life was fated. You could do nothing about it. Whatever was written in the stars was given to you, and you couldn't change it. Right? But with the spread of modern education, Western education, people changed their psychological mindset and said, we can take control of our lives. We can improve our lives. So, and I've seen the transformation myself, because if you take, for example, all my ancestors, none of my ancestors, right? Mother, father, uncles, grandfather, uncles, whatever it is, never went to university. One generation down, I became the first one to go to a modern university. Right? The generation below me, all my nephews and nieces have gone to university. What an amazing transformation in my lifetime. And that creates a psychological revolution that says, hey, we are in charge of our lives, right? That's a big deal. That's why the human condition has improved so much. And the last revolution, very quickly, I would describe as the revolution of good governance. And here I can tell you this as someone who was a dean of a school of public policy. Practices of good governance are spreading very rapidly around the world, and that explains the diminution of poverty, reduction of conflict, and so on and so forth. But as a result of all this, thanks to the West, we've had a wonderful situation. And so this should be the moment when, in theory, the West should stand up and say, hey, we should be celebrating the Western project to improve the human condition has succeeded. Hooray! Let's celebrate. But as you know, and as I know, there are no celebrations in the West. There's just doom and gloom. And the question is why? And my answer is that in the past 30 years, in precisely the period when the human condition improved dramatically, the West made 3 strategic mistakes. Strategic mistake number 1 was made at the end of the Cold War. That was the time when there were genuine celebrations here. And everyone enjoyed reading Francis Fukuyama's essay, The End of History, which said, hey, we made it. We defeated the Soviet Union without firing a shot. We've shown the world that there's only one road for history. We all have to become liberal democracies. The West has made it. We don't have to change and adjust. The rest of the world has to change and adjust. And as I say in a somewhat cruel fashion in this book, Francis Fukuyama's essay did a lot of brain damage to the West because he put the West to sleep at precisely the moment when the rest of the world was waking up. At precisely the moment when China and India were waking up. And why was the waking up of China and India so significant? Because from the year 1 to the year 1820, for 1800 of the last 2,000 years, the 2 largest economies of the world were always those of China and India. And it's only in the last 200 years that Western Europe took off and North America took off. But if you view the past 200 years of world history against the backdrop of the past 2,000 years of world history, it's been a major historical aberration. All aberrations come to a natural end, so it's perfectly natural to see the return of China and India. But as it was happening, the West decided to go to sleep. So that was strategic mistake number 1. Strategic mistake number 2 was made in 2001. Now what happened in 2001? Most people in the West remember 9/11. And I know the impact of 9/11 because I was living in Manhattan when 9/11 happened. I experienced the political shock. I know what a shock it was. But the effect of 9/11 was that the United States and some European countries marched into wars in the Middle East and got engrossed in wars there and didn't notice that something more fundamental happened in 2001, which was China's admission into WTO. And the reason why China's admission to WTO in 2001 was far more significant is because according to Western theories of economics, according to Joseph Schumpeter and creative destruction, when you suddenly inject 900 million new workers into the global capitalist system, there'll be creative destruction. So workers lost their jobs. And then you saw 15 years later, the election of Donald Trump. There is a connection in these things. And this is a result of not seeing the big changes that were happening. And the third strategic mistake I'll mention very briefly is that most people are not aware, again, of how rapidly China has emerged. In 1980, the United States share of the global GNP was 25% in PPP terms. China's share was 2.2%, right? Less than 10% of the United States. But in 2014, in one of a major historical moment, China's share became larger than that of the United States. And nobody noticed that that had happened. Nobody woke up and said, hey, how do we adjust to this new world? And that's why your US-China dialogue initiative is a very, very important one, because that's the most important relationship of our times. So these were the strategic mistakes. The question is, can the situation be redeemed? And the answer is yes. And what I propose in this book is the 3M formula that the West could adopt to try and adopt, to bring about a different world, a better world for the West and a better world for the rest. And the 3M strategy doesn't refer to this, I think the Minnesota Mining Company, it refers to 3 M words. And the first M word is minimalist. What do I mean by minimalist? Now here again is something that it may take a long lecture to explain this, but as you know, for the past 200 years, as Western power exploded around the world, the West began to intervene in the affairs of every society around the world. Indeed, by the end of the 19th century, the whole world had been colonized by the West. A few countries, China had not been colonized, but China had been humiliated, had settlements and so on and so forth, right? And the West sort of controlled the whole planet. Now, of course, after World War II, you saw decolonization, newly independent countries, and you thought, okay, Western intervention had ended. Unfortunately, the West continued intervening in the affairs of other societies long after that. And you've seen this even the last 2 decades with wars in Iraq, in Libya, in Syria. And it's almost like become a habit of intervening in global affairs. So one recommendation I have, a very simple recommendation I have is, please, the rest of the world has improved a lot. The rest of the world can manage their affairs very well. We don't need Western intervention anymore. And if you want proof of this, in my previous book, the book before this, called The ASEAN Miracle, I document how the most diverse corner of planet Earth, okay, by far, there are 650 million people in Southeast Asia, out of which there are 240 million Muslims, 120 million Christians, 150 million Buddhists, Mahayana Buddhists, Hinayana Buddhists, then you have Taoists, you have Confucianists, you have Hindus, and then you also have communists in Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia should be a zone of trouble and strife. But now it's become the second most peaceful corner of planet Earth after the European Union. How did it happen? The rest of the world has transformed itself. It's grown up. It can do these things on their own. So in the past, you may have needed Western intervention, but now you no longer need it. And one of the statistics that may shock you is that, as you know, President Barack Obama is a very peaceful man and tried very hard to bring peace during his presidency. But in the last year of his presidency, in 2016, the United States dropped 26,000 bombs on 7 countries. Why? Why drop 26,000 bombs? You don't have to do it anymore. There are difficult problems, but you can find other ways of solving them. Which brings me to my second M word, which is multilateral. Now, it's very dangerous to use the multilateral word because it's a word designed to put an audience to sleep. As you know, multilateralism, UN, very boring, everyone falls asleep. But actually, in a world where the rest of humanity has woken up, where you have more and more competent governments around the world managing their affairs, you can actually get the whole world involved in solving many of these problems. And if you can get them involved, the results will be better than what you've seen through unilateral interventions. Now, that's not the story that's given to you. To give you an example, if you read the speeches made by the United States ambassadors to the UN, you take a country like Syria, they will say, you see, Syria is a struggle between the democracies of the world and the tyrannies of the world which you find in China and Russia. I have that quote in this book. Okay, if you say you want to listen to the democracies of the world, I agree. Why don't you listen to the largest democracy in the world with a population of 1.3 billion people, which is India, and then the third largest democracy in the world, which is Indonesia, with 240 million people in the world. And if you listen to them, and this is what I quote a very distinguished Indian diplomat, Shyam Saran, describing the results of Western intervention, he says, in most cases, the post-intervention situation has been rendered much worse, the violence more lethal, and the suffering of the people who are supposed to be protected much more severe than before. Iraq is an earlier instance, Libya and Syria are the more recent ones. And as he says, in each case, no careful thought was given to the possible consequences of the intervention. So if you say you want to listen to democracies in the world, listen also to the non-Western democracies and see what they say about our world. That's why I say multilateral. But the third M word is the one word that actually I'm not supposed to use in polite Western company. And that M word is Machiavellian. I know many in the West see Machiavelli as a figure of evil. That's what, in this book, Leo Strauss, an eminent American political scientist, describes him as a figure of evil. But when I studied philosophy, I read a wonderful essay by the British liberal philosopher Sir Isaiah Berlin. And in that essay, he explains that Machiavelli's goal was not to promote evil, but to promote virtue. V-I-R-T-U, an Italian word that means more like virtue. He was trying to create a better world. And he was giving sensible, pragmatic advice on how you create a better world. So if the West could rediscover the culture of pragmatism that Machiavelli was trying to teach the West, that would also help to create a better world. So I know that we live in times where everyone feels very gloomy and very depressed. I do believe that if you actually read my book, you'll end up feeling much more cheerful. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Kishore. That was wonderful. And I think I can look around and everybody already looks like they're a little bit happier than when they walked in the room. Also, we're not yet near midterms, so that's the reason I think most of the students are happy. So the way we're going to do this is we're going to have a little bit of a conversation, then we're going to open it up to you all to ask your questions. And I will remind you now and also at the end that the dean has been gracious enough to stay afterwards to sign books for those of you who want them. They're out in the back there. But let me start by asking you, your book tells a story, but behind every book there is a story. And so I'd like to ask you first, like, what prompted you to write this book?
Well, I mean, what prompted me to write this book was this sort of what I call this growing disconnect between the West and the rest. You had this rather strange, in the past, it was always the Western societies that were the most optimistic societies on planet Earth, and you can get data on that. And the rest of the world was struggling, troubled, and lost, and so on and so forth. And then you could see in the last 10, 20 years this remarkable shift where all the surveys showed that the most optimistic societies in the world are not in the West, in fact, often in Asia. And the West has become progressively more and more gloomy. And if you ask young people in Europe today, for example, where the youth unemployment is 40, 50%, do you think your life will be better? They say, no, I don't think my life will be better. So the sense that I had was that many in the West thought they had lost it. So, and my view is that the West hasn't lost it. That actually the West can also participate with the rest of the world in this sort of more optimistic, dynamic, global dynamic that we have. Because the human condition, paradoxically, in the period when Western optimism has been declining, the human condition has been improving. And it improved more in the past 30 years than the past 3,000 years. So why this disconnect? So I was trying to bring it back and explain to Western societies, don't give up. There is a better world out there you can participate in.
But was there something, like was there a specific moment? Was there a specific conversation? Was it something you gave a talk somewhere and just saw doom and I mean, what was it like specifically that got you, at a personal level, and what got you to think, I need to write this, I must write this book, I need to explain to the West?
Yeah. Well, I have been sort of, in a sense, in one way or another, writing about these topics for quite a while. In fact, my first book, which is entitled Can Asians Think?
Right.
was published in 1998. And in it you will find something similar also. Signals to the West, hey, the rest of the world is waking up, and so on and so forth. But as you know, the amount of doom and gloom among Western intellectuals has never been greater. And I would say two events, especially if you look at what I call the liberal intellectual crowd, okay? Not just in the United States, also in Europe, by the way. There are two events, and interestingly, both happened in 2016. One was Trump, and the other was Brexit. And these were huge political shocks, because, I mean, when I was here in 2016, all the liberals, intellectuals were absolutely convinced that Trump could not possibly win. And that to me was quite shocking, the disconnect between the liberal intelligentsia and their own population, their own people, the voters, was quite shocking, So, hey, so what explains this disconnect? So I was trying to find the structural reason for that. Similarly in Brexit too, I think when David Cameron made the decision to have the referendum, apparently I was told, I was just in fact recently talking to some of my British friends, he and his advisors said, hey, there's no way the British people are going to vote for Brexit. They're not that stupid. Come on, it's suicide. They will never do it. But they did it. So it was a big shock. So in that sense, those two shocks was a kind of a wake-up call that led to me writing this book.
Great. Now the title of the book is Has the West Lost It? What is it?
You asked a question that the Chinese asked also. And you know why? Apparently you cannot translate "has the West lost it" into Chinese. It's got to be something. What is that something? And so I had to say, actually, if you want to, so in Chinese they said, "Has the West lost its way, its direction, its sense of momentum," and so on and so forth. So that's what I mean by it in this time.
Because when I looked at the title, I haven't finished the book yet, but when I looked at the title, I looked at the word "it" and I took it to mean when you lose something, you usually lose it to someone or to something else. And so how much of this book is certainly written and directed towards a Western audience, and how much of it is it written and addressing, as you said, a Chinese audience? A Chinese audience.
Yeah. Well, I think the primary audience for this book is clearly a Western audience, because I would be happier to see, I think it's better for the world to have confident, optimistic Western societies dealing with the world rather than troubled, insecure societies. And they say, as you know, we're now in the midst of a major trade war between the United States and China, and you can talk about what's driving it, but certainly one factor driving it is the feeling of many, let's say in America, that unless America comes down very hard on China, you'll never get back your jobs, right? But actually, economics teaches us that economics, unlike political games, is not a zero-sum game. That if the Chinese economy grows, it actually can be good for the American economy. And it can also be good for the American people. I mean, economics is not that kind of zero-sum game. But because it's the politics that's driving the relationship rather than the economics that's driving the relationship, people see it as a zero-sum game.
Sure.
So I'm saying if you focus on the economic side, there are tremendous opportunities for American businesses in China still.
Yeah. No, it's pretty clear that economics doesn't really explain this trade war. But if I could just take you further on the whole China question, suppose the West can't keep it. Suppose the West loses it. What are your views on whether China can actually get it or win it?
That's actually the subject of my next book. Seriously, I mean, I just for your information, after I stepped down as dean in December last year, I'm on a 9-month sabbatical. And actually I spent time in various American, and in fact I spent 2 months in Fudan also, university. So I'm actually right now formulating my thoughts for my book on the US and China. And it's very hard to answer questions about what will China do or what will it achieve, because China is a moving target. China is a moving target because it is, right now as you and I speak, it is adjusting all the time. It is, for example, to look at the current trade war, when it began, I think from what I understand, the Chinese officials, because they've done so many negotiations with the United States, they felt, okay, this is another round of difficult negotiations. By the end of the day, we'll make a deal and problem will be solved. And I think it's come as quite a big shock to the Chinese leaders to come to realize that what is happening now within US and China is something that's fundamentally different. The Trump administration is not trying to reach a deal. It's trying to alter the playing field in a very fundamental way. Now that's a different game, right? So clearly the Chinese government is now going through a period, I suspect, of deep introspection and trying to figure out what's going on here, right? It's a different game. So that's why you cannot say how the Chinese will react, because they're still thinking how to react. They're still trying to figure out what to do. And I hope that my next book, just as this book was trying to be helpful to the West, I'll try to find to be helpful to both America and China as they try to achieve a new balance in their relationship.
And as you explained your argument this afternoon, you noted that the very things that have, the very things that you attribute as positive things the West has done to help bring the state of the world to a greater sense of affluence and everything, are also in many of the ways the things that have been dragging it back. I mean, you say minimalist, for example, to move away from this interventionist policy, but you also note that the interventionism was part of what brought the rest of society, the rest of global society up. Do you, I guess, I think for many Americans, the notion that that if we look at someone like China, the rising illiberal hegemon, that there are aspects of the American hegemony that just don't translate as well if China is to rise and occupy this position. And so I guess the question really is that enough? I mean, what you advocate in the end is more of a minimalist, sort of check your values at the door, sort of multilateral approach. And is that, and if that's the case, is there an appeal of a sort of illiberal hegemon that can actually take us in not a very good direction?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very important question I'm going to try and address in my next book. But the question is, can
Sorry,
we move?
keep asking you about your next book.
I don't know. My simple answer to your question is, can we go beyond hegemony, though?
Yeah.
And this is where this is why China is going through a very plastic phase now, trying to figure out what its role in the world is. But how the Chinese behave will also be influenced by their past history, as you know. And the Chinese, for some reason, for whatever reason, never saw themselves as natural colonialists. Now, I don't know how many of you know this, but the Chinese in the 15th century, if I'm not mistaken, under Admiral Cheng He. Admiral Cheng He had a much bigger fleet, much bigger boats than the Portuguese ever had, right? The Portuguese with much smaller boats colonized South America. That's why you have Brazil, colonized Africa, you have Angola and Mozambique, took a bite of India, you have Goa, took a bite of China, Macau. Now that's a kind of a colonial, what I call it, drive. That's been very much part of Western history. But the Chinese, for whatever reason, haven't had that same drive. So, for example, Australia, as you know, is so far away from, let's say, the United Kingdom or England. Australia is so close to China. It's been close to China for 2,000 years. No Chinese went there. But the British came all the way, sailed halfway across the world, more than halfway across the world, landed in Australia, and Australia today is a remnant of a British colony, right? So the question, therefore, is, will China naturally follow what the West did as it becomes powerful? Now, there's absolutely no doubt that when China becomes more powerful, it will definitely become more assertive. Very clearly, no doubt whatsoever. But there's a big difference between becoming assertive and becoming aggressive. And that's the question. And for example, will the Chinese go out and bomb Syria? My answer is no. China will not. Because they can't figure out why. Why would you want to go and bomb Syria? So that the mentality, therefore, in some respects, is fundamentally different. So it will not, therefore, replicate the Western style of what you might call hegemonic intervention that the West has been doing.
Right.
But of course, but I have to qualify by saying that, because it depends also on how you treat China in this period. And if you provoke China, there's going to be a reaction. What kind of reaction? I don't know.
Yeah.
It depends on the issue, it depends on the context and everything, so on and so forth. So that's why the period of history we're going through now is very, very important. Because we're going to shape the future by many of the decisions we're going to make today.
But there is, I think implicit in your argument is a degree of confidence that what has been built since 1945, whether it's the neoliberal international order, whether it's an environment in which China and India could lift themselves out of poverty, whether it's any of these things, there's implicit in your argument is a confidence that that can continue if the United States takes a more minimalist role, right? And so the question really is, can it continue if the United States takes a more minimalist role?
Well,
China can offer a lot, but they offer many things that we, as you know, political scientists would describe as private goods. But hegemons don't just intervene; they also offer public goods, and that's that's the question.
Well, I'm asking okay, let me define, explain my points as clearly as possible. I'm asking for minimalist, unilateral interventions, and I'm asking for maximalist, multilateral interventions. So yes, intervene, but do it multilaterally. Now, there's one important point. We now live in a global village, okay, small, interdependent global village, and that's what Jack de Goya said when he introduced me, is what I've said. Now, when you live in a global village, like a normal village, needs a village council. Now, in the village council, you must make sure that all the villages are represented. And therefore, many of the multilateral institutions, and I give you just a simple example, the most important economic institutions are the IMF and the World Bank, right? And China is not trying to destroy them. China wants to keep them. But at the same time, you have to get rid of the rule that says to become the head of the IMF, you must be a European, belong to 5% of the world's population. Or to become the head of the World Bank, you must be American, right? With 3%, also 3-4% of the world's population, right? And the remaining 90% of the world's population don't qualify to run the IMF or the World Bank. That's got to change. So we're not going to get rid of the IMF, we're not going to get rid of the World Bank, but we're going to ensure that we have an IMF and World Bank where the sense of ownership is felt not just by 8 to 10% of the world, but also felt by the other 90% of the global village that we live in. That's what I mean by maximalist, multilateralist intervention.
And this is before we open up to the audience. I want to ask, I mean, and this is not that I believe this argument, but it's for argument's sake. I mean, when you describe sort of a minimalist, Machiavellian, multilateralist position, which essentially means also ceding more authority and rulemaking authority to others in the system, isn't that kind of what Trump is doing right now? I mean, he's kind of pretty minimalist in terms of wanting to intervene in other parts of the world, and he's definitely Machiavellian, right? In terms of checking his principles at the door.
I have to disagree with the last statement. Trump is too honest to be Machiavellian. I suppose I might take that as a compliment, right? He doesn't hide his intentions at all. I mean, he's out to sabotage Iran, and he says, I'm out to sabotage Iran. If he really wants to sabotage Iran, he wouldn't announce it. He's not Machiavellian. He's actually amazingly open. I mean, and frankly, to say that he's having exchange of love letters with the leader of North Korea, that's not Machiavellian. That's incredibly open.
But it is in terms of, I mean, part of the way, at least in the presentation, the way you described Machiavellian was being, basically being ultra pragmatic. That implicit is the criticism of the West has been too ideological or too in terms of imposing our system on others around the world. And so, I mean, the one thing, I mean, you're right. I mean, President Trump is honest. The one thing I would not consider him to be is principled in terms of ideology, and he is quite pragmatic. I mean, if he calls the North Korean leader, his new lover. I mean, we know what he wants. He wants his nuclear weapons, or in the case of Iran, he clearly wants to sabotage the deal. I mean, that's pretty pragmatic.
Well, I wouldn't use the word pragmatic to describe him. I would say he's extremely unilateral, and he still believes that the United States can single-handedly change the world. And that's a very unpragmatic position to take, And if he was pragmatic, he would actually not, number one, not undermine the most important alliance that he has, which is with Europe. And the fact, I'm actually quite stunned that Germany, France, UK, Russia, China, a very unlikely partnership, have now set up an alternative payment system to do trade with Iran. Now that, if you are really pragmatic, you wouldn't alienate your allies, which is what, and I just spent 4 weeks in Paris before coming here at Sciences Po. And the Europeans, who had a very high level of trust and confidence, at least in American good intentions, have lost it in a very profound way. And one of my friends, Sylvie Kaufman, the editor of Le Monde, actually, and I had lunch with her in Paris just 2 weeks ago, I guess. She actually published a page 1 piece in the New York Times explaining how what Trump was doing was damaging so much of what Europe stood for, and therefore damaging the alliance in a big way. And that's not pragmatism. That's ideology. And he has a certain ideology of his own, which is about America alone can do everything.
America alone can do what's good for America at the expense of all the rest of the world. So so part of your recommendations here, if it were for a Trump audience, not that this is about the furthest thing from a Trump audience, but your recommendation.
Are you sure?
Oh yeah, I'm pretty sure. Yeah, I'm pretty sure. But
maybe they don't dare to declare that Trump supporters in this room.
We're a pretty open political environment here, so but I've had them in my class, so the one or two, but what would be, so would this be the same message? This message I take to be a message being given to sort of many of the liberal internationalists in the West who, as you said, are in a state of real shock and depression and a variety of things. What would the message be to a Trump audience? Because that's when people here in D.C. and in this country look, that's all we see. That's all we talk about these days. What would be the message to that audience?
If the Trump audience is what I call the unhappy white working classes in America, that's the core base. My message to them is that you can create a better future for your children. And you can create a better future for your children by having an America that works with the rest of the world and tries to charge up the global economy and work together. And there's that. It's amazing. And in theory, if the United States was a company and not a country, and if China was a company and not a country, the United States as a company would find the best partner to have would be China as a company. Because the strengths of the United States as a company, right, is technological lead and advances and so on and so forth are tremendous. But China as a company has got tremendous infrastructure building capacity. Now, what does America as a company need now? America as a company now needs better infrastructure. The American Society of Civil Engineers has said that more than 3/4 of American bridges need to be fixed. And I genuinely hope you have nothing like what happened in Italy happen to you. But if you want to rebuild infrastructure, the company that is the best at the world and now producing world-class infrastructure is China. And it's amazing. I mean, when I as a young person, when I came to the John F. Kennedy Airport, whatever it was one of the best airports in the world, and Beijing Airport was a dump. Today, you want to go to one of the best airports in the world, you go to Beijing, and if you want to go to dump, you go to JFK Airport. I mean, and that's how the world has changed, right?
LaGuardia is even worse. It's even worse.
Well, you can have a competition. but what's even more shocking, and this is to me, I never thought it would happen in my lifetime. You want to see some really good airports? Go to Delhi. Go to Mumbai. Excuse me. how can Delhi and Mumbai have better airports than American airports? Isn't that shocking? That's how much the world has changed. And you can cooperate with this world. You don't have to be a hegemon anymore. You can be a partner. And if you're a partner, the opportunities to grow and develop are tremendous. And as you know, one of the biggest mistakes that Trump made was to walk away from the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
Sure.
That Trans-Pacific Partnership was a gift to America. Some of the best, fastest growing economies in Asia wanted to have a privileged partnership with America and prepared to give up, frankly, open up sectors that I never thought they would open up. Vietnam opened up so many sectors under TPP. And you were given this gift and you dumped it. That's being completely non-pragmatic.
No, I agree. It was one of the biggest strategic mistakes that we made, because TPP was not just a trade agreement at all. So.
And TPP was also a way of anchoring American influence in the region.
Yeah.
So if Trump was pragmatic, he wouldn't give this geopolitical gift to China.
Okay. Now is our opportunity to open it up to our students and other guests of the university community. So why don't we start in the back? Yes. So right there, yes.
Thank you very much. My name is Julian. I'm a second-year graduate student here at the School of Foreign Service. I really like your observation with regards to globalization and how the divide between rich and poor countries has certainly narrowed over the last 50 years. But I wonder whether this is the right question to ask for the title of your book. So I haven't read your book, I'm sorry, but I'd be interested to hear your opinion on that. Because I think the average American doesn't really care how the airport in Delhi or in Beijing looks, but what they care about is that for the first time ever, basically, the last 2 years, life expectancy in the United States actually declined, especially with regards to the working class. If you look at the average wage increase over the last 25 years of blue-collar and white-collar workers, actually stagnated. So aren't those the criteria you have to look at in order to understand why there was this wide revolt in the UK, in the US? And isn't this the problem of the consequences of globalization? Thanks.
Yes, I completely agree with you that issues like life expectancy are very critical. And by the way, in the same period, the last 30 years, while America has sort of stagnated, life expectancy in the rest of the world has shot up dramatically, really, really dramatically. And certainly in terms of wages and income, you're right, they've been stagnating here. And as I say in the book, the gap between the elites and the masses, the data in my book, has also grown a lot. And you're right, these are the issues that needs to be addressed. That need to be addressed. But the best way of addressing them is for America to work with the rest of the world and not against the rest of the world. So, for example, if you're looking for economic opportunities that will give jobs to people, you go and find the fastest growing economies and work with them and deal with them. For example, so that's what the rest of the world is doing. By the way, even though it's paradoxical that the greatest preacher of free trade agreements used to be the United States in the 60s, 70s, 80s, even up to 90s, I think. And then in those times, I know when I was ambassador to the UN, 84 to 89, all the third world countries, except Singapore, of course, said, no, free trade means you're going to exploit my economy. No, I'm going to close the borders. And it's very bizarre that the United States that used to preach free trade to the rest of the world, and basically, it's a Western theory, Ricardo's, whatever this theory, the comparative advantage and so on and so forth, makes it very clear that the more you trade, the better off you are, right? Your standard of living always goes up. So the rest of the world has now bought the virtues of free trade. Countries in East Asia are continuing to sign free trade agreements. We haven't stopped because the United States has stopped, but the United States has gone in the opposite direction. So this is where I think the United States got to go back and in a sense, go back to its own theories on what generates economic development. And what generates economic development is to utilize the theory of comparative advantage, produce what you are good at, And everyone keeps talking about the United States deficit in trade in goods, but the United States has a surplus in trade in services, right? And also, frankly, if you are a very rational, objective analyst, the United States economy benefits a lot because the US dollar is the global reserve currency, right? So which means the Chinese workers got to work very, very hard to produce the contents for the iPhone and send it to you. You can just print money and send it back to the Chinese worker, in theory. You can do that, right? So there are many benefits that the United States enjoys from the current system, which no one talks about, right? And if you don't pay attention to it, you might lose some of these benefits. And believe me, the next big shock, which I will talk about in my next book that's going to come, at some point in time, if people lose confidence in the US dollar as a global reserve currency, as a global reserve currency means it's a global public good. But a global public good has got to serve global interests. But if you take a global public good and you use it to serve unilateral interests, then people walk away from it. And if people walk away from it, then the consequences are quite bad. So there are lots of things that the United States can do positively to improve the conditions of its workers. It can be done. That's my message.
Great. We have a lot more hands going up. Yes, you start right here.
Thank you. My name is Ryan Menina. I'm a second-year graduate student in the Security Studies program. So when we talk about the gap between the liberal intelligentsia and the general population in the United States, one aspect of that gap that I found is outside the intelligentsia, a lot of the U.S. population is deeply skeptical of multilateral institutions, like the United Nations. And from my perspective, it looks like one of the reasons for that is like some level of perceived hypocrisy. So, when the General Assembly passes a resolution condemning a country's actions, over 80% of the time, it's in reference to Israel. Whereas, to my knowledge, there hasn't been a UN General Assembly resolution yet condemning China for having somewhere around 1 million Uyghur Muslims illegally imprisoned in Xinjiang province. So that kind of thing, to me, is a problem in terms of fostering trust in multilateral institutions. And I'm just wondering if you think that there's any responsibility that lies on the United Nations or similar institutions to try to rebuild that trust with the American public to encourage that multilateralism that you're seeking.
Yeah. I would say you've asked a very, very good question. And you're right, by the way, that the record of the United Nations is imperfect. You're absolutely right. But then, as someone who's lived as long as I have, I find most institutions in the world are imperfect. There's no perfect institution in the world. And for me, which are the least imperfect institutions in the world to work with? And the United Nations, for all its flaws, is still the least imperfect institution to work with for one very, very simple reason, okay? At the end of the day, if you believe in the theory of democracy, right, that you have to listen to the people's voices, there's only one place on planet Earth, by the way, you can go to listen to what 7.3 billion people believe. And I assure you that's the case, because if any United Nations, any ambassador from any country, whether it's from China, from Egypt, from Argentina, when he speaks at the United Nations, if he doesn't represent what his people think, he's toast, right? Whenever he speaks in the United Nations, he's got to make sure he reflects the views of his own people. So you may not like what he's saying, but what he's saying represents the views of his people. So the question is, do you want to listen to the voices of the 7.3 billion people on planet Earth? And if you want to listen, where do you go to listen to it? And that's the United Nations. And you're right about on the human rights issues, there are double standards. But by the way, if you want to hear what about the other side of the story, they will say, is it, how is it that, and I know this because the United States used to be the persistently published reports on the human rights standards of every country. The State Department does it every year. And until 2001 would condemn every country for implementing torture, right? And then in 2001, as you know, Guantanamo was set up. Now then when Guantanamo was set up, number one, the question is, why did the United States continue to publish reports on the rest of the world when it itself was practicing torture? But more importantly, all the European countries, which were very critical of the rest of the world when it came to torture, not one European country officially criticized the United States for implementing torture. Now, I bring this up because when it comes to human rights issues, unfortunately, you'll find everybody's got double standards. There's no such thing as a saint in this group. But despite that, I still believe that the cause of human rights is progressing dramatically in the world. And if human rights is at the end of the day about improving the human condition in as I say, in terms of liberation from extreme poverty, big deal, right? Liberation from ignorance, big deal. But also, as a result of what I call the spread of the principles of good governance, less and less human beings are now being subject to arbitrary governance. And that's a great improvement in human rights. In many societies, you could just be sent to jail on the whim of an official. Now, less and less is happening. So if you look at it objectively, in terms of the real conditions of the 7.3 billion people, the human rights conditions of the world have improved. And what will shock you is that the reason why it has improved is that every country in the world has to submit a report to the United Nations on how it has improved its human rights situation. And as someone who had to draft the Singapore report, we had to study what we did, right? So, for example, there are demands on how the condition of the women, condition of the children. You got to provide data to the UN. Yes, we have improved the condition of children in Singapore. Yes, we have improved the condition of women in Singapore, and here's the data. So that's what the UN does. So don't write off the UN. Believe me, this is a shock to many people because you are and it's, by the way, it's not true that the liberal intelligentsia loves the UN because the New York Times rubbishes the UN as much as the Wall Street Journal does. So unfortunately, there are very few UN lovers in the world. One of my good friends was Kofi Annan. I was very sorry that he passed away recently. But I actually declare myself passionately as a lover of the United Nations. And I still believe, especially in a small interdependent global village, there's no better alternative to the United Nations.
Let's go to this side of the room. Fellow in the green shirt.
Hi, my name's Advait Arun. I'm a freshman in the School of Foreign Service. I want to thank you for speaking today. What's your take on China's economic expansion, where they decouple investment in non-Western economies from human rights? I know the United States tries to couple investment in other countries with guarantees of human rights and prosperity for everybody. But do you think it's a smart idea to not make human rights a precondition for investment and growth of economies around the world?
I must say, I'm very glad that these questions on human rights are surfacing because it gives me a chance to explain how complex the issues are. And but I hope you do know that the United States has invested in countries where there are violations of human rights. I mean, look at all the Gulf countries, right? Look at the condition of women in those countries, right? As you know, women can't drive in some countries, right? Now, has the United States invested in those countries? Yes, it has. So, again, my simple answer to you, there's no such thing. Countries are not saints. Countries follow their interests. And during the Cold War, by the way, the United States was very close friends with some of the bloodiest dictators in the world. Mobutu of Zaire, okay? General Zia of Pakistan, okay? So I want to give you this piece of history because sometimes many Americans think that you are the only virtuous country in the world and everybody else is not virtuous. But the rest of the world looks at you and says, you're not any much worse than us, but you're not much better than us. You are the same. We are all basically the same. And the rest of the world actually wants to improve the situation. Now, then when it comes to what China does, if the Chinese investment in a country where the human rights record is bad leads to economic development, as you know, very often economic development leads to improvement in the human rights condition. So if it creates a virtuous circle, you may not necessarily see an immediate result, but in the long run, you see incredible transformations. Look for example, like say a country like South Korea, right? It had a terrible dictator, Park Chung-hee, and conditions were terrible, by the way, under him. The middle class grew, exploded, there was a political transformation, and today South Korea is very, very different. So if you want that kind of story to happen, you have to promote economic development. And if China is promoting economic development, that's a good thing for the world.
But here, so the counter argument would be that there is nothing empirically incorrect with what you just described. But at the same time, the difference between the United States and China funding economic development projects is that they're, even if they are with dictatorships, there is a longer term value-laden objective behind whatever the U.S. plan is for different parts of the world. Whereas in the case of China, there isn't, right? I mean, this is the direction of the question. So you just gave the example of South Korea. Yes, you could argue that the United States teamed up with bloody dictatorships in South Korea, but eventually spurred growth, middle-class income, that then engendered a political transformation in the country. But that transformation didn't happen absent the United States at the same time preaching, human rights, democracy, rule of law, transparency, that eventually had an impact on decisions that, not just South Korea, but, I mean, there are a lot of failed state-building projects that we can point to where the West, you can say, wasn't successful. But there are also successful ones, and many of them are in Asia, right? Whether you're talking about Taiwan or Japan, South Korea. So, I'm just curious, like how. I know this is all the topic of your next book, so it's kind of.
I mean, you see, the thing is, I'm in a very uncomfortable position because I'm here in the United States, so I don't want to say things that are, make
okay.
you all very uncomfortable.
We all have a thick
but
skin,
for example, if you say that the United States is always on the side of democracy, then I would say go and talk to the people of Egypt, right? They had a democratic, elections. The democratic elections was overturned, and the United States supported the overturn of democratic elections in Egypt. It's a fact, okay? So it's not true that the United States automatically supports democracy. United States supports democracy when it is in American interest to do so. It's a fact. Take Algeria, okay? Algeria had elections. The elections were overturned. Western Europe embraced the military government. So these are realities of the world that you have to understand. We live in a very imperfect world. And the question is, how do we make that imperfect world better? And my view is that you do it by slow, pragmatic steps and not by being ideological and judgmental. And unfortunately, this is not just true of Trump. This predates Trump. This goes back. It's part of an American tradition. You're very judgmental and ideological when you should be more pragmatic, and understand that in general, the world, by the way, is getting to be a better and better place.
Okay.
Right. That's the important message.
Okay. We have time for a couple more questions. So why don't we go to this fellow in the glasses? A student who's been very patient. So yes.
Thank you. I'm Arjun. I'm a third-year student in the School of Foreign Service. So my question about the Machiavelli piece, I found that interesting in terms of working with regime types that differ from liberal democracies. But do you think there's an implicit contradiction when you also talk about multilateralism? Because it's much harder to pick and choose countries you work with. When in a multilateral system, by definition, you need to work towards a consensus where you need to convince most countries and not just your alliance partners.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. It's much harder working in a multilateral setting. But if you want to, let me give you specific examples of major global challenges that we face. Number one, global warming. You think a coalition of the willing of just your partners can solve global warming? If you don't bring in China, you don't bring in India, how are you going to solve global warming? So you have to work with countries that you're uncomfortable with if you want to solve global problems. Take global overfishing, right? As you know, our fish stocks are being depleted dramatically. You mean a coalition of the willing, United States and Europe can solve global overfishing? No way. You have to get the other 6.5 billion people outside Europe and North America to be involved to solve the problem of global overfishing, right? I can give you global challenge after global challenge that is coming our way, and you have to work with the people, all the countries of the world, and the only place you can do that is the United Nations. Now, by the way, one of the most successful things we have done is creating something called the Convention on the Law of the Sea Treaty, right? UNCLOS. Why do you think UNCLOS is working? UNCLOS is working because, fortunately, virtually every state in the world, except the United States, has signed and ratified that treaty. And because every state in the world has signed, ratified the treaty, it is working. And that's why ships can travel around the world freely, because the laws and regulations are all fixed. What can be done, what cannot be done. So if you really want to improve planet Earth, it's the only planet we have, by the way. There's no planet B we can go to. You have to work with the 7.3 billion people in the world. If you think you're going to work with a small slice of humanity and solve global problems, you will not succeed.
Yes, sir, right here.
Neil with the McCourt School of Public Policy. I'm an exchange visitor. You talked about the trade war between the United States and China. What's your advice of ASEAN? Thank you.
ASEAN?
Yes, sir.
Well, I think the ASEAN countries, I think you all know the 10 ASEAN countries, right, in Southeast Asia, do not want a trade war. Because all the ASEAN countries are actually believe in trade. And the ASEAN countries have benefited a lot through trade. And the country that has benefited the most from trade in the world is Singapore, by the way. Singapore's total trade is over three times the size of its GNP. No other country comes close. And so we know the virtues of free trade better than any other country in the world. So if you ask the ASEAN countries, they don't want to see this trade war between United States and China. They would prefer to see the United States and China resolve this issue. Because, unfortunately, in the real world, fortunately, as a result of 20 to 30 years of globalization, so even when you manufacture this American product, the iPhone, right? The parts come from all over the world, including all over Southeast Asia and China and so on and so forth. And that's what makes this phone so great, right? But to dismantle it is very difficult, because there's some parts that can only be made very well by different producers in different parts of the world. You can't bring all the production back to the United States. If you can, in theory you can. You're going to cost 10 times as much, right? If you want to buy an iPhone 10 times as much, you can do that. Manufacture it here. But if you want to live in the real world, and most countries in the world actually, paradoxically, want to see more trade. And therefore, they want to, ASEAN countries, if you ask them what their views are, they would actually plead with both the United States and China and say, please stop this trade war. It's bad for us too.
Where do you think it's going, this trade war?
That's what I actually came to Washington, D.C. to find out. Because so far, everybody in the world is very puzzled by where it's going. I think I was in Beijing in late June or early July. 5 of us were invited to Beijing, a very unusual group. Tom Friedman, New York Times, Martin Wolf, Financial Times, Neil Ferguson, Carl Bernstein, and myself, 5 of us. And so we were discussing the trade war. And I think that was when the Chinese were beginning to get puzzled. They assumed, and as you know, some deals were apparently reached between Steve Mnuchin and his counterparts. And the Chinese are prepared to make a deal. I mean, I'm pretty sure that China will be happy to buy another $50 billion, another $100 billion of American products. Sure, why not? They'll be happy to buy it. But the question is this, and this is the fundamental question, is it about a trade deficit, which is one problem A, or is it about China developing a technological capability which may one day be better than the United States in some areas? Example, artificial intelligence. And the Chinese thought they were dealing with problem A, about the trade deficit. Now they're beginning to realize that no, the focus is on problem B. And some people in the Trump administration want the Chinese to give up their technological development. And the Chinese say, why should I give up my technological development? It's what every country tries to do. So the question, therefore, is when you ask what's going to be the outcome of the trade, is it about problem A? If it's about problem A, there is a solution. Problem B, no solution. Because China will not give up its desire to improve its technological capability. And every country wants to improve its technological capability.
Right. But without taking other people's technology. Right.
That's right. I agree.
Right. Yeah.
And you know something? If you look at the history of the United States, in the 19th century, when the United States prospered a lot by stealing British intellectual property. But after you develop your own capability, then you became a defender of intellectual property. The good news is that China is now developing enough intellectual property, it's happy to join you in defending intellectual property.
We have time for one more question. I want to try to... Jennifer, yeah.
I'm Jennifer Bowie, Global Health. I'm a faculty here. I know this is a love letter for the West, and I really enjoy your talk. But since you're here, and we have here in the audience many students coming from Asia, or maybe some come from China. What would be your advice for Asia and China specifically at this moment?
Well, I think my big advice to my fellow Asian friends, and I've also published a lot on that, is that Asia's success is, as I say in this book, a result of gifts from the West. And we must thank the West for these gifts. But at the same time, we've also benefited a lot from a global order created by the West, the liberal, what they call rules-based international order. And the West was happy to be the custodian of this liberal rules-based international order, as long as the Western societies perceive themselves to be also the biggest beneficiaries of this international rules-based order. But today, the biggest beneficiaries of this Western-created liberal international rules-based order are the Asian societies. So the Asian societies who have been, in one way or another, I'm exaggerating a bit, have been free riders on this liberal international rules-based order, have got to stop being free riders and become co-custodians. To become a co-custodian means that you got to work harder to strengthen this order. So for example, one reason why the World Trade Organization is not doing well is that in the past, the drivers of the World Trade Organization vehicle were the United States and Western Europe. Now, as you know, the United States is walking away from free trade. Western Europe is nervous about free trade. Who's going to drive the World Trade Organization? And unfortunately, no Asian government as of now is ready and willing to take on the job of custodianship of these organizations. And if you're young Asians, trust me, the burden is going to fall on the young Asians to take on some of the responsibilities that the West used to undertake as a gift to the rest of the world in the past.
Sure, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. The title of the book is Has the West Lost It? There's a reception outside and a book signing for all of you students if you don't have to rush off to class. So thank you again. Thank you.
Thank you.